Have you ever looked into a dense, dark forest and felt like it was calling to you? Like the trees were breathing, keeping secrets that only the brave, or the completely lost, could discover? That is exactly where our story begins today, deep in the misty, emerald heart of an ancient forest, where the modern world just stops existing. But before we dive into the rain, the isolation, and the intense romance of this story, I want to share a quick message with you. If you enjoy these BL storytelling videos and want to support the continuation of this channel, you can join my Patreon, SpicyTimeBL. YouTube does not always make it easy to monetize this kind of storytelling content, so Patreon really helps me keep creating these stories for you. You can find the link in the description and pinned comment. And for those who want the continuation of the videos, bonus scenes, early access, and more uncensored 18+ BL content, SpicyTimeBL is where you can find it. Your support means the absolute world to me. Now, take a deep breath. Imagine the scent of pine needles, wet earth, and cold rain. Wrap a blanket around yourself, and let's get into the story. Our main character is Elias. He's 26 years old, and honestly, he is exhausted. Not just physically, but deep in his soul. For the past 4 years, Elias has lived the chaotic, high-pressure life of an urban photojournalist in the city. He's been surrounded by noise, sirens, concrete, and endless deadlines. He needed to breathe, so he took a month off, rented a tiny, rundown car, and drove hundreds of miles away to the edge of the Pacific Northwest wilderness. He brought his cameras, intending to photograph a rare species of silver fox rumored to roam the deep woods. But deep down, Elias wasn't looking for a fox. He was looking for silence. The problem with silence, though, is that it can be incredibly dangerous if you aren't prepared for it. It was his third day in the forest. Elias had hiked much farther off the designated trail than he should have. The canopy of towering redwood and pine trees was so thick that the afternoon sun could barely pierce through the branches. The air was cool, damp, and perfectly still. Too still. Elias was looking through the lens of his camera, focusing on a patch of ferns, when he felt the first drop of rain, cold, heavy, and sudden. Within seconds, the sky above the canopy turned a bruised, violent shade of purple, and the sky opened up. This wasn't just a rain shower. It was a torrential, blinding downpour, a freak mountain storm. "Damn it," Elias muttered, hastily shoving his expensive camera into his waterproof bag. He zipped up his jacket, pulling the hood over his dark, messy hair. He turned around, trying to find the markers he had left to guide himself back. But the rain was falling in thick, gray sheets. The forest suddenly looked entirely different. Every tree looked the same. Every shadow looked like a trap. He started walking fast, his boots slipping on the slick mud. Panic, cold and sharp, started clawing at his chest. The temperature was dropping rapidly, the wind howling through the branches like a wild animal. He couldn't see 10 feet in front of him. And then, it happened. Elias stepped forward, but there was no ground beneath his foot. He had walked right over the edge of a steep, muddy ravine. He cried out, tumbling backward, sliding through thorn bushes and wet earth, scraping his hands, until he slammed hard against the trunk of a massive fallen tree at the bottom. The impact knocked the wind completely out of him. He lay there in the mud, gasping for air, the freezing rain violently pelting his face. When he finally tried to stand, a sharp, white-hot pain shot up his right ankle. He collapsed back into the mud with a groan. It was twisted, badly. "Help!" Elias yelled, though he knew it was pointless. The sound of the storm swallowed his voice instantly. He was miles from civilization. No cell service. Nobody knew exactly where he was. He pulled his knees to his chest, shivering violently, the terrifying reality setting in. He was going to freeze out here. His vision was starting to blur from the cold and the pain when he heard it. Not the wind, a heavy crunch of boots on wet branches. Elias forced his eyes open, wiping the rain from his face. Through the gray mist and the pouring rain, a figure was climbing down the side of the ravine. The man was tall, broad-shouldered and imposing, wearing a heavy waxed canvas jacket and dark boots. A lantern swung from his gloved hand, cutting through the gloom with a warm, golden light. Elias froze, his breath hitching. The man stopped a few feet away, raising the lantern. Under the hood of the jacket, Elias saw a face that was strikingly handsome, but carved with a rugged, intimidating harshness. Sharp jawline, dark, wet hair clinging to his forehead, and eyes the color of a stormy ocean. He looked to be in his late 20s, moving with the quiet, powerful grace of someone who entirely belonged to the wild. "You're a long way from the trail, city boy," the man said. His voice was deep, a low, resonant rumble that somehow cut perfectly through the howling wind. It sent a strange, involuntary shiver down Elias's spine that had nothing to do with the cold. I slipped," Elias stammered, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. "My ankle. I can't walk." The stranger sighed, a harsh sound of annoyance. He set the lantern down and stepped closer, crouching right in front of Elias. Up close, the man smelled of cedarwood, wood smoke, and rain. It was intoxicating. "Of course you did," the man muttered, reaching out. His hands, even through his gloves, were massive. He gently, but firmly, pressed around Elias's ankle. Elias winced, hissing in pain. "It's not broken, but you're not walking on it," the man said, looking up. For a split second, their eyes met. Elias felt a sudden, heavy jolt in his chest. The man's eyes were intense, piercing right through him. "Who are you?" Elias whispered. "Julian," the man replied shortly. "And I'm the guy who's going to keep you from dying out here. Put your arms around my neck." Elias hesitated. "What?" "Unless you want to sleep in the mud, put your arms around my neck," Julian commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. Elias awkwardly reached up, wrapping his shivering arms around Julian's broad, solid shoulders. Before Elias could even brace himself, Julian slid one arm under Elias's back and the other under his knees, lifting him up into his chest effortlessly. Elias gasped, instinctively clinging tighter. Julian was incredibly warm. The heat radiating from his body was like a furnace against Elias's freezing skin. Julian didn't say another word. He just picked up the lantern and began climbing back up the steep, slippery ravine, carrying a grown man as if he weighed nothing at all. Elias buried his face into the crook of Julian's neck to shield himself from the stinging rain. He could feel the steady, powerful rhythm of Julian's heartbeat against his own chest. It was the most deeply comforting thing Elias had ever felt. They walked for what felt like an hour. Elias drifted in and out of consciousness, lulled by the motion and Julian's warmth. Eventually, the sound of the rain changed, hitting something solid, a roof. Julian kicked open a heavy wooden door and carried Elias inside, kicking it shut behind them. The storm was instantly muted. "Welcome to my humble, off-grid palace," Julian muttered sarcastically. Elias blinked, looking around. It was a rustic, one-room cabin. It was incredibly cozy, filled with the smell of dried herbs, old wood, and coffee. There was a cast-iron wood stove, a small kitchen area, shelves packed with books, and one large bed in the corner. Just one. Julian carried him straight to the bed and set him down gently on the heavy quilt. "Strip," Julian said, turning his back to walk over to the wood stove. Elias's eyes widened, a sudden flush of heat rising to his face despite the freezing cold. "Excuse me?" Julian tossed a few logs into the stove and grabbed a box of matches. He glanced over his shoulder, one dark eyebrow raised. "You are soaking wet and shivering. Hypothermia is a real thing. Take off the wet clothes. Get under the blanket. I'll make tea. Don't flatter yourself. I'm not looking." Elias felt embarrassed, but he knew Julian was right. His fingers were so numb he could barely work the zipper of his jacket. He managed to strip down to his underwear, his skin covered in goosebumps, and quickly slid under the thick, heavy blankets. The bed smelled just like Julian, cedar and clean sweat. It made Elias's heart do a strange, nervous little flutter. Julian walked back over, carrying a steaming mug and a first aid kit. He pulled up a wooden chair and sat next to the bed. He handed the mug to Elias. "Drink," Julian ordered softly. Then, without asking, he pulled the blankets back just enough to expose Elias's injured ankle. Julian had taken his gloves off. His bare hands were rough, calloused, and large, but the way he touched Elias's bruised skin was unexpectedly, breathtakingly gentle. Elias watched Julian's face as he worked, wrapping a tight compression bandage around the ankle. Julian's eyelashes were long, casting soft shadows on his cheekbones in the warm, flickering light of the fire. "What were you doing out there?" Julian asked quietly, not looking up. "Taking pictures," Elias said, taking a sip of the hot, sweet tea, trying to find the silver fox. Julian scoffed softly, a faint smirk touching the corner of his lips. "The silver fox? That's a local myth to get tourists to buy keychains in the town, 30 miles from here. You almost died for a ghost. Elias frowned, feeling defensive. I needed a reason to be out here. I needed a break. Julian finally looked up, his stormy gray eyes meeting Elias's hazel ones. The silence in the cabin suddenly felt incredibly loud. The rain battered against the tin roof, but inside, the air was thick with an undeniable heavy tension. Julian looked at Elias like he was trying to read his soul, like he could see every exhausting secret Elias was hiding. Well, Julian said, his voice dropping an octave, softer now. You got your break. The storm is supposed to last for 3 days. The roads will be washed out. You're stuck with me. Elias swallowed hard, his heart racing. Stuck in a tiny cabin, with a man who was as intimidating as he was captivating. Thank you, Elias whispered, for saving me. Julian held his gaze for a second too long, a flicker of something undefinable passing through his eyes. He gently patted Elias's good leg through the blanket, stood up, and took the medical kit away. Get some sleep, Elias. He knew his name. Elias realized he must have seen the ID on his camera bag, but hearing his name in Julian's deep, rough voice made a fresh wave of warmth rush through his body. The first night was difficult. Elias was in pain and running a mild fever from the exposure. Julian didn't sleep. He stayed up in the wooden rocking chair by the fire, reading a book by lantern light, occasionally getting up to press a cool, damp cloth to Elias's forehead. Every time Elias opened his heavy eyes, Julian was there, a silent, protective guardian in the dark. By the second day, the fever broke, but the storm outside had worsened. The wind screamed through the trees, making the sturdy cabin creak. Because Elias couldn't walk, Julian had to do everything for him. At first, there was a prickly, defensive barrier between them. Julian was a man of very few words, preferring silence, moving around the cabin with practiced efficiency. He cooked, he chopped wood on the covered porch, he read. Elias, a man used to constant motion and conversation, felt awkward and useless. But forced proximity has a funny way of stripping away defenses. On the afternoon of the second day, Julian was making soup at the small stove. Elias was sitting up in bed, his camera in his hands. He was looking through the photos he had taken before the fall. He lifted the camera, aimed it at Julian's back, and adjusted the focus. Julian was wearing a faded gray Henley shirt that stretched tight across his broad shoulders. Elias admired the strong lines of his back, the way his dark hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck. Without thinking, Elias pressed the shutter. Click. Julian stopped stirring the soup. He turned around slowly, crossing his arms over his chest, leaning against the counter. He didn't look angry, but his gaze was heavy. Did you just take a picture of me? Julian asked, his voice low. Elias felt his face burn red. He slowly lowered the camera like a child caught stealing candy. The lighting was good. The firelight. I'm sorry. Julian stared at him for a long moment. Then, he uncrossed his arms, walked slowly across the small room, and stopped right beside the bed. He reached down and gently took the camera from Elias's hands. His large fingers brushed against Elias's knuckles, sending a jolt of electricity straight up Elias's arm. Julian looked at the digital screen. He stared at the photo of himself for a few seconds. You capture things well, Julian said softly. He handed the camera back, his eyes catching Elias's and refusing to let go. But, if you want to look at me, you don't need a lens to do it. Elias stopped breathing. The air in the cabin suddenly felt 10 degrees hotter. Julian's gaze dropped, just for a fraction of a second, to Elias's lips, before he turned around and went back to the soup, leaving Elias completely flustered, his heart hammering in his ribs like a trapped bird. That was the turning point. The invisible wall between them began to crumble. That evening, the power from Julian's solar batteries drained completely because of the lack of sunlight. They were plunged into darkness, lit only by the golden, dancing flames of the wood stove, and a few candles Julian placed around the room. Julian brought 2 bowls of stew to the small table next to the bed. Since there was only one chair, Julian sat on the edge of the mattress, right next to Elias's legs. They ate in companionable silence for a while, the sound of the rain providing a rhythm to their thoughts. Why are you out here, Julian? Elias asked softly, breaking the silence. You don't strike me as someone who just hates people, but you live like a ghost. Julian stopped eating. He stared into the fire, the shadows playing across his strong, handsome features. For a moment, Elias thought he had crossed a line, asked too much. But then, Julian sighed. I used to be a firefighter, down in California. Wildland Rescue. Julian's voice was quiet, stripped of its usual gruffness. I loved it, but I lost a lot of good friends in a bad blaze 3 years ago. I survived. They didn't. The noise of the city, the sympathy looks, the noise in my own head. It was too much. I came up here to the woods to fix up this old family cabin. Told myself I'd stay for a month. It's been 3 years. Elias's heart ached. He looked at the strong, capable man beside him and suddenly saw the deep, quiet sorrow he carried. Without overthinking it, Elias reached out. His hand trembled slightly, but he laid his palm gently over Julian's rough hand resting on the bed. Julian flinched slightly at the contact, surprised. He looked down at Elias's pale, slender hand covering his, and then slowly lifted his eyes to Elias's face. "You were running from the noise too," Elias whispered, his eyes full of understanding. "I get it." Julian didn't pull his hand away. Instead, he slowly turned his hand over and gently wrapped his long fingers around Elias's, squeezing softly. His thumb brushed over Elias's knuckles. The touch was so tender, so incredibly intimate in the quiet, candlelit cabin, that Elias felt a tear prick the corner of his eye. "Yeah," Julian murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I guess I was. But it gets lonely running." They sat like that for a long time, hands linked together in the dark, the storm raging outside but utterly powerless against the warmth building between them. Now, before we get to the climax of the storm, and what happens between Julian and Elias as the tension reaches a breaking point, just a small, warm reminder. If you want more story continuations, bonus scenes, early access, and uncensored 18+ BL content, you can support me on SpicyTimeBL. Your support keeps these stories alive, and the link is right there in the description and pinned comment. Let's get back to the cabin. Day 3, the final day of the storm. The tension in the tiny cabin had evolved from awkward strangers to an intense magnetic pull that neither of them knew how to handle. Every time they passed each other in the small space, a shoulder would brush. Every time Julian handed Elias a cup of water, their fingers would linger together. Elias found himself constantly watching Julian, the way his muscles moved, the way he laughed a deep, raspy chuckle when Elias made a sarcastic joke, the way his eyes softened whenever he looked at Elias. Elias was falling for him, hard, and he was terrified, because he knew as soon as the storm broke, he would have to leave. That afternoon, the wind reached a terrifying peak. Elias was sitting by the window, watching the trees violently swaying, when a deafening, explosive crack echoed through the forest. Before Elias could even process the sound, Julian was moving. A massive pine tree right outside the cabin had snapped in the wind and was falling directly toward the roof. "Elias, get down!" Julian yelled, lunging across the room. He grabbed Elias by the waist, pulling him out of the chair and throwing them both to the floor, just as the top branches of the heavy tree smashed into the side of the roof with a terrifying boom. The cabin shook violently. Dust and a few shingles rained down from the ceiling, but the sturdy old logs of the cabin held. The main trunk of the tree had missed the roof by inches, scraping down the side of the house. For a long, breathless minute, neither of them moved. They were tangled together on the wooden floor. Elias was lying flat on his back, and Julian was hovering directly over him, his arms braced on either side of Elias's head, shielding Elias's body completely with his own. Elias's chest was heaving, his heart hammering frantically against his ribs. He opened his eyes. Julian's face was only inches away from his. Julian's eyes were wide, scanning Elias frantically. "Are you hurt? Did anything hit you?" "No," Elias breathed out, his voice shaking. "No, I'm okay. You protected me." Julian let out a heavy, shuddering exhale, dropping his forehead down to rest against Elias's shoulder. The adrenaline was pulsing through both of them. Elias could feel the heavy, solid weight of Julian's chest pressed against his own, rising and falling rapidly. Slowly, Julian lifted his head back up. They were so close, too close. Elias could feel Julian's warm, slightly uneven breath dusting his lips. Julian's stormy gray eyes locked onto Elias's, dropping down to stare at Elias's mouth, before snapping back up to his eyes. The protective panic in Julian's gaze was rapidly melting into something else entirely, something dark, hungry, and deeply vulnerable. Elias felt a surge of courage. He slowly lifted his hand, his fingers trembling, and gently cupped Julian's rough, bearded cheek. Julian let out a ragged breath, leaning heavily into the touch, closing his eyes for a brief second, as if Elias's hand was the only anchor he had in the world. "Julian," Elias whispered. "I shouldn't," Julian murmured, his voice a gravelly, desperate whisper. "You're going back to the city. You're leaving." "I'm here right now," Elias replied softly. His thumb brushed over Julian's bottom lip. That was all it took. The last bit of restraint in Julian shattered. With a low groan, Julian shifted his weight, tangling one hand into Elias's dark hair, and finally, desperately, closed the distance between them. The kiss was explosive. It held days of unspoken tension, fear, and longing. Julian kissed him like a man who had been starving for years and had finally found a feast. His lips were slightly rough but demanding, pressing firmly against Elias's. Elias let out a soft sound of surrender, wrapping both arms tightly around Julian's broad neck, pulling him closer, opening his mouth to deepen the kiss. It was messy, breathless, and intoxicating. Julian shifted, pulling Elias up slightly off the floor so he could hold him tighter. One heavy hand resting firmly on Elias's waist, the other cradling the back of his head to protect him from the hard floor. Elias's hands roamed over the thick muscles of Julian's back, feeling the heat of him, drinking in the taste of coffee and mint and pure, unbridled desire. When they finally broke apart to breathe, they didn't go far. Julian kept his forehead pressed against Elias's, both of them panting softly in the quiet aftermath. "Don't leave," Julian whispered, the raw honesty in his voice breaking Elias's heart. "Please, Elias, don't go back to the noise." Elias closed his eyes, tears threatening to spill. I have a life there, Julian. I have a job, an apartment." Julian pulled back slightly, the warmth leaving his eyes, replaced by a defensive, familiar mask. He nodded slowly, his jaw clenching. He pushed himself off the floor and stood up, offering a hand to Elias. "Right," Julian said, his voice flat, emotionless. "Of course you do. I'll check the damage outside." He turned and walked out the door, leaving Elias sitting on the floor, his lips bruised, his heart utterly shattered. The next morning, the storm broke. The sky was a brilliant, blinding blue. The forest was washed clean, dripping with sunlight and fresh rainwater. But inside the cabin, it was cold. Elias's ankle was much better. He could put weight on it, wrap it tightly, and walk with a slight limp. Julian was quiet. He packed Elias's camera bag, made him a thermos of coffee, and handed him a heavy walking stick. They walked side by side through the forest. The journey back to the road where Elias had parked took 2 hours, and they barely spoke 10 words. The silence, which had felt so comfortable the night before, now felt agonizing. When they reached Elias's small, dirt-covered car, Elias unlocked the doors. He turned to look at Julian. Julian stood there, hands deep in the pockets of his jacket, looking everywhere except at Elias. "Thank you, Julian," Elias said, his voice tight. "For everything. For saving my life." Julian finally looked at him. There was a profound, heavy sadness in his stormy eyes. "Drive safe, city boy." He didn't step forward for a hug. He didn't ask for a number. He just nodded once, turned his back, and began walking back into the dark tree line. Elias watched him go until he disappeared completely. A crushing weight settled onto Elias's chest. He got into his car, started the engine, and drove away. 2 weeks passed. Elias was back in his high-rise apartment in the city. The noise was unbearable. The sirens, the traffic, the constant ringing of his phone. Everything he had thought was his life now felt like a cage. He sat at his computer desk, editing the photos from his trip. He clicked through the landscapes, the ferns, the rainy canopy. And then, he clicked to the next photo. It was the picture of Julian, standing by the fire, looking over his shoulder, his eyes dark and intense. Elias stared at the screen, a tear slipping down his cheek. He touched his own lips, remembering the taste of cedar, the heat of Julian's body, the desperate whisper of "don't leave." What the hell was he doing here? He was miserable. He had been miserable long before he ever drove to the woods. Julian had been right. He had been running. But he hadn't realized that what he was running toward was waiting for him in a cabin, miles off the trail. Elias made his decision in 10 seconds. He picked up his phone, called his editor, and quit his job. 4 days later, the sound of a car engine echoed softly near the edge of the forest road. Elias packed only his essentials into a heavy hiking backpack. His ankle was fully healed now, He knew the trail. He knew the markers. He walked into the dense green canopy of the trees, and for the first time in his life, he didn't feel lost. He felt like he was walking home. It took him a few hours to reach the familiar, deep part of the woods. As he neared the clearing, he smelled it before he saw it. Wood smoke. Elias pushed through the final layer of thick ferns and stepped into the clearing. Julian was on the porch, chopping wood. He was wearing just a white t-shirt and jeans, swinging a heavy axe with practiced, powerful grace. Elias stopped, simply watching him for a moment, his heart swelling with so much love it physically ached. "You're gonna dull the blade swinging it like that," Elias called out over the sound of the cracking wood. Julian froze. The axe stopped mid-swing. Slowly, as if he was afraid he was hallucinating, Julian lowered the axe and turned around. When he saw Elias standing at the edge of the clearing, a heavy backpack over his shoulders and a bright, nervous smile on his face, Julian actually dropped the axe. It hit the wooden porch with a dull thud. Julian stared at him, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He didn't say a word. He just stepped off the porch and started walking toward Elias. The walk quickly turned into a fast, determined stride, and then he was practically running. Elias dropped his backpack into the dirt just as Julian crashed into him. Julian grabbed Elias by the waist, lifting him completely off the ground and burying his face into Elias's neck. Elias let out a joyful, tearful laugh, wrapping his arms fiercely around Julian's wide shoulders, burying his fingers into his dark hair. Julian held him so tight Elias could barely breathe, but he didn't care. He inhaled the scent of cedar, sweat, and pine, feeling whole for the first time in years. Julian slowly lowered Elias to his feet, keeping his large hands securely on Elias's waist. He pulled back just enough to look at Elias's face, his stormy eyes wide with disbelief, shining with unshed tears. "You came back," Julian whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "You actually came back." "I quit my job," Elias said, wiping a tear from his own cheek with a soft laugh. "I packed up my apartment. I have absolutely nowhere else to go. I hope you meant it when you told me not to leave." Julian let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "I meant it. God. Elias, I meant it." He didn't hesitate this time. Julian brought his hands up, cradling Elias's face gently, and pulled him down into a deep, desperate, wildly romantic kiss. This kiss wasn't fueled by the fear of an impending storm or a sudden goodbye. It was a promise. It was slow, soft, and infinitely sweet, their lips moving together perfectly in the quiet isolation of the woods. Elias melted against him, letting Julian explore his mouth, letting all the longing and the heartache of the past weeks dissolve into the warmth of Julian's embrace. When they parted, Julian kissed Elias's forehead softly, resting his chin on top of Elias's head, holding him against his chest. "It's a small cabin, city boy," Julian murmured playfully into his hair. "You sure you can handle it?" Elias smiled, closing his eyes, listening to the steady, strong heartbeat of the man holding him. "As long as there's only one bed," Elias whispered back, "I think I'll be just fine." And as the late afternoon sun finally pierced through the tall trees, casting a warm, golden glow over the clearing, Julian picked up Elias's heavy backpack, took his hand, and led him inside. The forest kept its secrets, but it had finally given them exactly what they were looking for: each other. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. I hope you felt the tension, the rain, and the romance in the air. If you loved Elias and Julian and want to support the continuation of these videos, please consider joining my Patreon, SpicyTimeBL. There, you can get bonus scenes, early access, and much more uncensored 18+ BL content. You can find the link in the description and pinned comment below. Thank you for your amazing support, and I'll see you in the next story. Stay safe and stay romantic.